Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts, the director of the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to a discussion of the troubled US-ROK alliance and South Korea's nuclear option with Dr. Jennifer Lind and Dr. Daryl Prez. Before introducing the two of them, let me just say a few words by way of introduction to the subject. As veterans of CGSR events will know, we have made a priority at our center of understanding the requirements of extended nuclear deterrence in a changing security environment and of understanding the views and interests of US allies. From this work, we've taken away three main insights. The first is that there's a clear mismatch between the renewed salience of extended deterrence and the level of attention it gets in the US nuclear deterrence community, which remains heavily focused on the central strategic balance with Russia and now with China. The second key insight is that allies are under nuclear and other forms of pressure from their revisionist neighbors and are anxious about the political will of the United States to run nuclear risks on their behalf. And they're anxious about the continued and future ability of the United States to make capabilities available globally in support of US allies. And the third insight is that these matters are especially acute in East Asia, where US allies are under growing pressure of various kinds, including direct existential threats from new nuclear weapons, other new military threats to their sovereignty and integrity, concern about the possible decoupling of the United States from their defense and loss of American resolve to defend them, and also doubts about the technical ability of the United States to, in their word, re-extend deterrence protection with nuclear weapon systems designed for that purpose. These allies in East Asia have sought more NATO-like extended deterrence arrangements, often without a great deal of clarity about what NATO-like actually means and the actual nature of extended nuclear deterrence in Europe. And these allies in East Asia are also engaged in debates about nuclear options of their own. These have been quiet debates, usually behind closed doors, but they're becoming louder. And these have been narrow debates among a group of experts. They're becoming broader and reaching deeper into the national political discourses of these countries. Our two speakers today have made an important new contribution to our collective thinking on these topics. They do so by tackling what has been heretofore a taboo topic, the possibility that South Korea's acquisition of a nuclear deterrent of its own might make strategic sense for the Republic of Korea, for the US-ROK alliance, and indeed for the United States. So I'm very much looking forward to their introductory remarks. They will speak for approximately 45 minutes, maybe a little less, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Our two speakers are Dr. Jennifer Lind, who is an associate professor in the government department at Dartmouth College and a research associate at Chatham House in the UK, and also a faculty associate at the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies at Harvard University. Dr. Lind has previously worked as a consultant for the RAND Corporation and for the Office of the Secretary of Defense. She holds a PhD in political science from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and she's also a graduate of the University of California, San Diego, and the University of California, Berkeley. Welcome back to the West Coast, so to speak. Daryl Prez, Dr. Daryl Prez is Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth. His work focuses on U.S. foreign policy, deterrence, and future warfare. He has spoken previously at the Center on the topic of his book on calculated credibility. And he is the author of a 2020 book on the myth of the nuclear revolution, which explores nuclear deterrence challenges in the 21st century. Dr. Press has a PhD also from MIT, but a bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago. It's a pleasure to welcome both of you today. Thanks so much for making the time to do this. We'll proceed with your remarks, and then I'll turn to the raised hands electronically. Please don't wait to the last minute to raise your hands electronically. As questions come to you in the course of the conversation, please ready your hands so that we can launch into the conversation. Daryl, Jennifer, over to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brad. And thank you everyone for attending today. It's really exciting for us to have this audience to discuss these issues with. I love the idea of bringing in a lot more technical concerns, which I'm hoping you guys will, than is often done in the audiences we speak with. So again, thank you all for coming. We're really excited. I'm going to kick this off and then send it over to Daryl, who's going to conclude the talk. And then we're very excited for what hopefully will be a great discussion. So again, as Brad mentioned, we have been doing this project on the US-ROK alliance and talking about the tensions in the alliance that have been emerging and investigating, well, what's at the root of these tensions and what can be done about it. So many people emphasize that this is driven by domestic politics in both countries. So again, it's the effect of Donald Trump and the things that he said or did with respect to South Korea, or maybe it's the effects of progressive rule in South Korea, which is always a more difficult time in alliance relations between the two countries. But it's certainly the case that domestic politics are going to have an effect, and in recent years we see the kind of negative effects of that. These are exacerbating problems, but the sources of trouble, in our view, are actually rooted in major geopolitical changes in East Asia. So what we're going to argue today is, first, there are two geopolitical developments, and that's the rise of China and trends in North Korean nuclear technology that together are eroding the strategic logic of the US-ROK alliance. And as a result, the US nuclear umbrella and deterrent is becoming less credible. Second, we'll argue that there are a range of ways to address such problems of extended deterrence, and we'll reference some during the Cold War. But none of these, we argue, adequately addresses the problem. And so third, for this reason, we discuss an option that, as Brad mentioned, is often treated as too sensitive to even discuss, but which is ironically frequently discussed in South Korea itself. And already, indeed, many signs suggest that this is the direction that South Korea is heading, that is toward an independent South Korean nuclear deterrent. So let me first take a step back and talk about these two geopolitical trends that are going on that we argue are at the source of a lot of tension that we're seeing right now. The first is China's rise. China's rise has created a situation in which the key foreign policy goals of the United States and South Korea are misaligned. So for South Korea, the alliance is a tool to deter North Korea and preserve the country's geopolitical independence. And that allows Seoul to resist pressure from Beijing. But so far, Seoul has not had to commit to a broader US-led competition with China. But the United States, for its part, is increasingly focused on managing China's rise. And American leaders want South Korea to participate in the effort to counter China's growing power and influence. I should note this is not just, to create some sort of coalition of the willing, maybe for symbolic reasons. This is because any sort of managing China's rise is going to require a lot of capability. China has formidable capabilities and formidable defender advantage in the region, addressing this is going to require significant capability. So it's not just we'd like to have more signatures at the bottom of our document. It's that we need countries, powerful countries in the region to participate. So as the difficulty and danger of managing China's rise I was going to say, is the difficulty and danger of managing China's rise grow. The fact that a major partner who's a recipient of substantial US military support is standing on the sidelines of America's key national security mission will be increasingly problematic. But in South Korea's view, the alliance is about deterring North Korea. South Koreans never agreed. They never signed on for a US effort to contain China. China is South Korea's #1 trading partner, which often relies on economic coercion to punish countries whose behavior Beijing doesn't like. So this would be going down a significantly costly, dangerous road for Seoul. So far, Seoul's been hedging between the United States and China, not wanting to destroy its important relations with Beijing. The second key trend relates to North Korea's nuclear developments. And initially, Pyongyang fielded a small nuclear arsenal comprised of fission weapons deployed on missiles that could hit targets within East Asia. And slowly, as I'm sure you all have been monitoring very closely, the North Korean nuclear arsenal has grown. And now it includes some fusion weapons, and Pyongyang is developing missiles that can carry its arsenal all the way to the continental United States. From the American perspective, this drastically changes the risk-reward calculus of alliance with South Korea. So previously, being called on to defend South Korea would have risked a few tens of thousands of US military personnel in combat. Now, this is a huge commitment in itself, but one that seemed acceptable given the US global mission and global strategy. However, when Pyongyang acquires a mature long-range nuclear arsenal, which appears to be just around the corner, a war in Korea could mean the destruction of multiple American cities. The costs of being South Korea's ally are going up 1,000-fold. And this connects to that first trend, of course. As the costs and risks of the alliance rise, it's appearing less and less relevant to the United States' primary national security goal. So it's important to see that these two trends are connected. Now, from South Korea's perspective, the growing risk to American cities should profoundly undermine the credibility of the US commitment. So in 2000, for example, if North Korea had invaded the South, American forces would surely have flowed onto the peninsula to defend Seoul. But moving forward a few years from now, it's hard for rational South Koreans to imagine that a rational American president would keep these alliance commitments to Seoul in the event of a war, if doing so would trigger nuclear attacks on the US homeland. All right, so the first major point here is that we have found ourselves in a situation where there's a big credibility problem in the US-South Korea alliance. So how do we address this? What are potential ways that we could address this? This emerging extended deterrence problem is not a new phenomenon, at least not in the world. The United States and its allies faced it during the Cold War. Changes in Soviet nuclear capabilities led to doubts about the US nuclear umbrella and NATO, and that ended up transforming NATO policy in a variety of ways. So of course, two countries, Britain and France, acquired their own independent arsenals. Some allies participated in NATO nuclear sharing. This was prior to the signing of the NPT, and so that was not illegal. Under this program, the United States stored and continues to store US-owned nuclear weapons on its allies' bases in Europe for the purpose of transferring those weapons to the allies at the outbreak of a major war. And additionally, the credibility problem during the Cold War encouraged the United States to deploy enormous numbers of ground and air forces with their families all across Europe to deeply entwine the United States in any major war in Europe from the outset. Some people might argue that the US and South Korea could address the extended deterrence problem in their alliance through one of these strategies. So first, Washington and Seoul could adopt a policy of nuclear sharing, as the US did and does with its NATO allies. And alternatively, the United States could redeploy American nuclear weapons to the Korean Peninsula, which were stationed there before being removed in 1991. But looking at these different options, both of them seem rather symbolic. They're just two versions of essentially what we have now, which is an American nuclear umbrella, American nuclear weapons that have been promised to defend Seoul. In the nuclear sharing version, the Allies would plan for the United States to transfer weapons to South Korea to its control if circumstances warranted their use. And in the forward deployed option, US forces would employ the weapons themselves. But these deployment strategies, as I said, are merely superficial changes from the status quo. The weapons would only be used if authorized by an American leader. So there is, in fact, growing concern in South Korea about the US willingness to use nuclear weapons to defend South Korea, and neither of these options addresses that fundamental issue. So one might argue that nuclear sharing was enough for several NATO allies during the Cold War, but we would point out several key differences from that era. First, the credibility of the United States to take great risks on behalf of its NATO partners decades ago was far greater than we can imagine US credibility would be on the Korean Peninsula today. During the Cold War, the United States was threatening to use nuclear weapons if necessary to prevent the conquest of Europe, an event that would fundamentally alter the global balance of power and fundamentally negatively affect American security. So the magnitude of those stakes made American threats much more credible than any issues that are at stake on the Korean Peninsula today. Second, in Europe, the United States stationed two corps of ground forces on the continent, as I mentioned, along with their families. And there was no way for the Soviets to conquer West Germany without killing tens of thousands of Americans. And in Korea, the United States has actually been moving most of its small contingent of ground forces that remain away from the DMZ. So again, we've been reducing rather than growing the US force posture there, and we're moving it south, further away from the place where it had long occupied as a tripwire. Now, while it's possible South Koreans will seek and maybe will be reassured by a nuclear sharing option or a forward deployment, we argue this does not address the fundamental credibility problem with the US extended deterrent. And so that leaves us to this other option, which was the one pursued during the Cold War by Britain and France, of an independent arsenal. And I'm going to turn it over to Daryl now to discuss that.
Hey, thanks, Jenny. Hey, can somebody give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Excellent. As Jenny was speaking, it occurred to me that somehow I've been completely outmaneuvered here. Jenny gets to relay the sober, cautious sounding part of the talk and speak in calm tones about long-term geopolitical trends, about important alliances that are suddenly under strain. And then she moves off camera and lets me make the part of the argument that's going to get people howling and protesting. And I
think it all balances out because you have a chicken behind you.
Well, I was just saying, talk about alliance burden sharing. In many ways, this entire talk at a meta level is an illustration of the difficult dynamics in the US-South Korean alliance. But let me just jump in and highlight, I'm really going to address 4 things and do so relatively quickly. The first is Jenny's given you a taste of the problem as we see it that's developing in East Asia, and kind of tempted you or teased you with the idea that South Korean nuclear weapons might help with that. But let me first clarify what precisely we're proposing and what we're not proposing, number 1. Number 2, let me hypothesize for a second what a South Korean arsenal, at least initially, might look like, and how big a step it is that they would have to take from where they stand now to where they'd want to be. Number 3, let me address from a US standpoint, what would US support for this look like if we decided this is something that enthusiastically or reluctantly we were prepared to support? And lastly, let me circle back to the trends that Jenny raised and at least speculate for a few minutes about how that development might help mitigate some of the core problems in East Asia that she identified. So I'll go through those 4 points one at a time. All right, first one, taking a step back and trying to clarify what we're proposing. Let me say 3 things. First of all, what we're suggesting is that South Korea can decide, and perhaps should decide, to build an independent nuclear force. It might be wise for them to do so. What I want to clarify is that this is not a US action we're suggesting. In fact, it probably does not align with US foreign policy preferences. When we've spoken about this to people in the past, actually many people on the US and South Korean sides have been receptive, at least privately, to this idea. But they often say, I can't believe you're going to suggest that we let South Korea get nuclear weapons, or maybe even that we help them get nuclear weapons. And actually, we're not proposing either of those things, just to clarify. It's not up to the United States to let South Korea get nuclear weapons. South Korea, of course, is an independent country. It's a law-abiding member of the international system. And given the geopolitical trends that they face in their region and the increasing strains in the alliance they rely upon, what we're suggesting to you is that regardless of what you think about South Korean nuclearization, they are thinking about South Korean nuclearization, and they're not crazy for doing so. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is South Korea can go down this path legally and be fully justified in doing so. I was in a talk on a related topic not that long ago, and a very eminent US analyst of nuclear matters dismissed this idea and said, well, look, South Korea needs to choose between Samsung and a nuclear deterrent. It's going to clearly choose Samsung. And what he meant was a South Korean nuclear weapons would be such an appalling step, such a violation of international law and international norms that they would suffer grievously in ways they're not willing to suffer. But in reality, a South Korean nuclear arsenal done the right way would neither violate international law nor be a violation of any fair standards of international behavior. The NPT was written with exactly this circumstance in mind. Namely, the NPT's Article 10 allows members in good standing to withdraw from the treaty for precisely these reasons, if the matters under consideration of the treaty require them to do so. In other words, if a member or non-member of the treaty takes steps that puts the fundamental national interests of the member state in jeopardy. And that has clearly happened in this case. So South Korea has the legal right to withdraw from the treaty. This is not a loophole. This is why Article 10 exists. And not only is it legal, I would say it's justified, given the fact that South Korea faces a nuclear-armed adversary who threatens them frequently and whose nuclear weapons are illegal because they violate a whole host of UN Security Council resolutions. It would be a legitimate and proportional response for South Korea to legally withdraw from the treaty, express its dismay and reluctance for having to do so, and acquire its own nuclear arsenal. All right, the last thing I'll point out very quickly is to say, this would not necessarily have to mean the end of the US alliance. We could make it the end of the US-South Korean alliance, but we're not forced to do so. we have a long-term relationship with South Korea, which spans many, many dimensions of cooperation. And like our relationship with nuclear-armed Britain, which sits alongside our treaty relationship with Britain under the context of NATO, we could have a security relationship with a nuclear-armed South Korea, which sits beside our security relationship with them as well. So taking a step back, what do we mean? We mean an independent South Korean step to build a nuclear arsenal consistent with international law and norms that could still leave the South Korean-US alliance intact if we wish to allow that. All right, that's the first point. Second point, what might such an arsenal look like? Well, obviously, there are many ways South Korea can go in this direction, but let me just make a few quick points. First of all, the technical steps they would have to take, there are some, but they're not enormous. South Korea already has some experience with both uranium enrichment and separating plutonium. South Korea is already engaged in major upgrades to strengthen the hardened aircraft shelters at a couple of their air bases, or I should say build new, much harder aircraft shelters at a couple of air bases. And number three, South Korea is already in the process of deploying a class of conventionally armed ballistic missile submarines. In fact, they had a successful SLBM test not very long ago. So what this means is that they are actually well situated to develop a nuclear arsenal along the dimensions that you might imagine. So when we think about this, we imagine an arsenal developing probably in two stages. First, a bare bones arsenal to get a deterrent force into being, and then a more sophisticated one. The bare bones one, they already have the components. We're probably talking about developing simple fission weapons or maybe boosted fission weapons. They'd probably be well suited with air-delivered weapons on existing F-16s that could be based at one or more air bases in South Korea with hardened aircraft shelters. And as I said, they already have conventionally armed ballistic missile submarines, which create them a terrific foundation for an expanded, more secure, more sophisticated follow-on force to come. Last point I'd make on this topic is to say, South Korea may already be moving in the directions that we're suggesting right now. That in addition to those new hardened aircraft shelters and this puzzling, expensive mechanism for delivering conventional missiles, meaning the submarine force, there is significant routine discussion in South Korean political circles about this topic, about whether or not South Korea should do so. It may be taboo, as Brad said, to discuss this in the United States. It is not taboo within South Korea, number one. Number two, the South Korean public seems open to this idea. Now, there was a recent poll which found that 70% of South Koreans favored an independent South Korean nuclear force. I don't put much stock in that, because unless you put in front of the respondents the potential benefits and all the potential costs of doing so, unless they're wrestling with the decision in total and hearing views on both sides, I'm not sure if their positions should be taken very seriously. But what it does convince me of, and should convince you of, is that they're not allergic to this idea at all. In fact, the trend in South Korean public views is exactly in this direction. And the last thing I'd say about this is to say, Jenny and I have recently published a couple things about this idea. And the reaction from South Koreans who've chosen to reach out to us is rather interesting. Sure, we've got outreach from South Korean academics and South Korean military officers, which to my surprise has almost entirely been in favor of them doing so. But that might be a self-selected group. What surprised me more is the contacts we've received from journalists at South Korea's major centrist newspapers, whose questions to us are not of the nature, why would South Korea take such a provocative step, and wouldn't this throw the region into disarray? But they're of the nature of, can South Korea really do this without becoming a pariah? In other words, they're open to the idea, and they think their South Korean readers want to understand better whether or not there would be big adverse consequences. All right, so first, what is it we're proposing? Second of all, what might a South Korean arsenal look like? Third, if South Korea moves in this direction, and if the United States decided to perhaps reluctantly support its Korean ally, what would support actually mean? As we're probably all aware, actually lending technical support is largely prohibited by the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the fact that we would still be a member. However, there's at least 4 types of support that South Korea would very much need. Number 1, general diplomatic support, which is South Korea would need somebody, preferably the United States, to be arguing in public, to be arguing to allies, to be arguing to anyone who would listen, that although this development is unfortunate, it is being caused not by decisions in Seoul, but by the development of an illegal nuclear arsenal by Pyongyang. That the fault for this turn of events is the government in North Korea and those who enable them. That South Korea is acting defensively and developed an independent deterrent force, or is developing one, because it's been forced to by the actions of others. So that diplomatic message, that diplomatic support would be important. Second of all, institutional support. As I mentioned in passing, the reason North Korea the reason their nuclear weapons are illegal and the reason that they're vulnerable to all sorts of international sanction is because they essentially have no close friends on the important international bodies, even China. The United States, on the other hand, could make it clear that they were going to vote against any punishment of South Korea on the Security Council and other key international forums. Number 3, it would be important to retain the US nuclear umbrella over South Korea during the transition period. The NPT requires a 3-month warning period before countries fully withdraw. And there would also be some period of time, though I don't think very long, after that in which South Korea would be developing a primitive nuclear arsenal. And they would require or definitely benefit from the US nuclear umbrella to continue in the context of the existing US alliance in that period. And lastly, the United States could be open to retaining the alliance in its broad contours today. All right, very last thing, and then we want to turn this over to a discussion, is how does this address the problems that Jenny started the talk by enumerating? The answer, to be frank, is it doesn't solve these problems. You know, the geopolitical problems in East Asia are probably the problems in a broad sense that all of us are going to be wrestling with through our entire professional lives. How do you manage the international order with a rising China? How do you adjust the political and alliance relationships that currently exist? These are long-term problems, and a South Korean nuclear arsenal does not solve them, but it mitigates several of them. First, it enhances deterrence on the Korean Peninsula. Whereas today, the threat is if somebody, imagine it's North Korea, uses nukes on South Korea, the retaliatory threat, the retaliatory response will come from the United States. That's a story which will be harder and harder to convey as US cities grow more and more vulnerable to North Korea's retaliatory methods. If South Korea has its own nuclear arsenal, its retaliatory threat will be much clearer and much more credible, and hence this would enhance deterrence. Number 2, it would reduce, although not eliminate, the danger to the United States that we would get sucked in to a nuclear exchange were conventional war to break out in Korea. Today, we get sucked in almost immediately because, as I said, the alliance's nuclear deterrent is our nuclear deterrent. And so if the nuclear threshold is crossed in that war, and I think there are good reasons to worry it might be, immediately it would be our weapons engaged and our cities at risk as long as North Korea can deliver them. But once South Korea has an independent nuclear force, sure, North Korea could lash out against us, but the likelihood of doing so and the reasons that force them to do so would be much weaker. And lastly, and this is something we didn't talk about much, but let me just put this out there, an independent South Korean nuclear force might make South Korea more independent from China's political orbit in the long term. And here I'm thinking a little bit of like the old escalation dominance arguments, but in reverse. Namely, if South Korea at the highest levels of force can defend itself and deter attacks on itself, to some extent that would hopefully allow them to resist Chinese pressure at lower levels as well, especially if they're doing so in the context of an alliance with the United States. All right, let me conclude with one last little idea, which is as you're listening to these ideas, as you're thinking about them, I'd ask you to view them in wearing two different hats. So I would imagine that most, though not all of you, are Americans. And if you are, think about this problem from a US standpoint, or from the standpoint of US national interest. And ask yourself, is it possible that we would be better off if South Korea had an independent nuclear arsenal? And my honest to God judgment is maybe. I can't tell. On one hand, perhaps yes, because it'll enhance deterrence. And if deterrence fails on the peninsula, conventional deterrence or nuclear deterrence, it's a big problem for us. So enhancing deterrence is good for us. On the other hand, an independent nuclear capability for South Korea, number one, reduces substantially our control and leverage in Northeast Asia. And number two, it simply runs against one of the strongest themes in US foreign policy for decades. So is it good for the United States? Maybe. It's debatable. Hat number two, if you were South Korean, would you favor an independent nuclear arsenal, given the trends that Jenny described, and just given the baseline truth that you have a neighbor who has nuclear weapons, who's an international outlaw, who threatens you routinely, and your nuclear ally faces greater and greater credibility problems and reasons not to defend you with nuclear weapons? Given that, would you as a South Korean favor independent nuclear forces? And then the last thing I want you to consider, back as an American, is regardless of whether you think this is the best outcome for the US, if South Korea decides it's what they need, are we better off lending them the diplomatic support that our ally requires, rather than cutting them loose and forcing them to deal with this dangers on their own? All right. There are lots of difficult issues here, lots of potential counter arguments, many things to discuss. But let us end there and open this up to conversation.
Great. Thanks so much to both of you for sketching out very clear and interesting arguments.